Hello, my name is Norman Graham and I'm a minister in the Baptist Union of Churches in Scotland. The aim of these signposts is to try and help to connect the text of the Bible with our everyday lives. Today's signpost explores adult themes. And so our reading is from Colossians chapter 3 and verse 5. Put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature: sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry. One of the first verses in the book of Ecclesiastes is so universally accepted as being true that it has become proverbial in Western cultures. Chapter 1 verse 9 says, "What has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun." It's used as a proverb in relation to a wide variety of situations, and it particularly applies to the issue of idolatry and the worship of false gods. It probably never crosses our minds to think of the gods of the ancient world are alive and well in the 21st century Scotland, but the evidence suggests otherwise. So over the next few weeks, this series of signposts will consider ways in which the old gods of the Greco-Roman world, albeit with new names, are indeed alive and well and worshipped in our culture today, perhaps even in the church. In fact, whilst researching this series, I've discovered that many people are quite literally worshipping these gods today, even by the names which they were known by in the ancient world. So today we're going to consider the Greek goddess Aphrodite. Known as Venus by the Romans, she was thought to be the goddess of love and beauty, but also of passion, sex, pleasure, fertility, and victory. In the ancient world, she was also the patron of prostitutes and homosexual men, and so even today, many homosexual men worship her by her old name, Aphrodite. Whatever name people worship her by today, there is no doubt that she is worshipped. The ancient city of Corinth had a reputation for being extremely sexually promiscuous, although there is little actual evidence to sort of support that. However, there is ample evidence to suggest that it is the very Western democracies that were founded on Christian ideals that now worship Aphrodite in their promiscuous, anything-goes pursuit of sexual pleasure. It's no exaggeration to say that the cultures of Western liberal democracies are sex-obsessed, and that obsession is embedded in every form of media and in every aspect of life. As any marketing guru will tell you, sex sells. We now live in such a sexually permissive society that things that would have been considered porn a generation ago have become part of the mainstream culture. But we shouldn't imagine that the church is somehow protected from the impact of the sexual permissiveness that permeates our society. According to Andrew Boa's research, he says that sexual brokenness is no longer the exception amongst young Christians. It is the norm. Internet porn, sexual assault and abuse, and overall sexual self-centeredness plague Christians and non-Christians alike, vandalizing God's beautiful gift of sexuality. There is no doubt that sexual behaviour that would have been considered perverse a generation ago is now socially acceptable. In fact, to question that behaviour is to be labelled as a bigot. And it makes me wonder where we'll be a generation from now when we're already at a point where, as far as sex is concerned, everyone does what is right in their own eyes. Will the few things that are sexual things that are deemed to be unacceptable in society today be acceptable in 50 years from now? In psychology literature, the word perversion has been replaced by paraphilia as it is deemed to be less offensive. The contemporary attitude is summed up in this quote from a 1971 study on Victorian sexuality. Perversion is a word that has no final meaning. What might be a perversion in one century can be normal in the following. It helps to consider it as a subjective term, denuded of all its ethical overtones, and ask of a specific perversion what physical harm it does. Then ask a subsequent question: What psychological harm does it do beyond satisfying the wishes of the protagonist? In other words, if it feels good, do it. The Bible would beg to differ. The Apostle James writes that each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. Then, after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. What that means is that whilst our society's toleration and promotion of sexual permissiveness not only helps to fuel people's sexual desires, but it also normalizes them, even if they are perverse. Nonetheless, as James notes, each person is responsible for how they behave morally. Many people today, even in the church, may not think of sexual immorality as idolatry, but in the First Testament, it's always connected with idolatry, either as the way that people are led into idolatry or as an expression of their idolatry. In the Roman world, Aphrodite was openly worshipped in a celebration of human eroticism through temple prostitutes and orgies. Whilst there are no longer any temples dedicated to her, there is no doubt that our cultural obsession with sex is nothing less than the worship of Aphrodite, though few might know to call it that. The eroticism of Aphrodite's worshippers is, however, nothing more than a pagan caricature of the God-given sexual desire. It implies that sexual activity is the cure-all, the greatest good, the one thing for which we were made. Newspapers and magazines scream this message at us. Advertisement hoardings hit us in the face with it. The goddess Aphrodite offers bliss, escape, transports of delight. But like all idolatries, we think that if we can just have this romantic relationship or that sexual experience, it will fulfill our deepest hopes and longings and will give our lives the meaning that our souls crave. But the reality is very different. Those who worship Aphrodite may sacrifice many things at her altar: time, money, deep or lasting relationships, unborn children, emotional maturity, secure jobs, health, and even life itself. She remains inscrutable, holding out glittering promises which turn out to be mirages, and yet her worshippers come back for more. Sigmund Freud believed that our every action was devoted to the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. Yet what we discover again and again is that when we devote ourselves to pursuing pleasure, pleasure ceases to be a delight. When we pursue something as the thing that will satisfy our soul's deepest hopes and longings, we soon discover that it fails to satisfy, and so we must pursue either another thing or a deeper experience of that same thing. The consequences of an anything-goes approach to sex and sexuality are obvious to see both in the church and in the wider society, with sexual crimes at an all-time high, and many unreported. In 2017, the Me Too movement was born following news reports of sexual abuse by the American film producer Harvey Weinstein. The movement exposed the astounding scale of sexual harassment and abuse that women face every day in our society. Unfortunately, it has helped to change attitudes to the acceptance of such behaviour. And the church has had its own Me Too movement, especially in the United States, albeit with more limited success. A 2006 survey showed that 50% of men and 20% of women in churches are addicted to pornography. According to Christian counsellors, a significant portion of their work is dealing with the loneliness, the misery, and the heartaches that so often accompany sexual sin. So I think we have to take it as a given that Aphrodite is worshipped within the church as well as outside it. The question that we have to address is, how are we going to deal with this idolatry in our lives? Well, firstly, we have to recognise it as idolatry. We must understand that when we commit sexual immorality, we are not merely surrendering to our sexual desires or giving in to temptation. we are committing idolatry. Specifically, we are worshipping at Aphrodite's altar. In the First Testament, God is understood to be the husband of his people in the same way that Christ is the bridegroom of the church in the New Testament. Idolatry then is firstly and always spiritual adultery that in turn is often expressed in sexual immorality. Secondly, we must recognise that as subjects of King Jesus, Christians are called to live according to the distinctly different sexual ethics of his kingdom. Jesus' disciples are to reject the sexual immorality of their surrounding culture. Paul is even firmer here, telling us that we must put sexual immorality to death. The word translated as sexual immorality is porneia. It's a catch-all term for all kinds of sexual activity that goes beyond the boundary set by the one flesh relationship ethic of Genesis 2 and 24. Interestingly, the root word carries the sense of buying or paying for something, so it's often related to prostitution. But fundamentally, though, it suggests that sexual immorality always exacts a price, spiritually, relationally, and in a variety of other ways. It turns out, despite what the kids in the 60s told us, that there is no such thing as free love. The sexual ethics of the kingdom of God extend beyond our actions to the intentions of our hearts. The Pharisees taught that provided you didn't commit the act of adultery, you were okay. But in Matthew 5, verse 28, Jesus said that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery in their heart. Thirdly, we must recognise the need to learn and practice a genuinely Christian sexuality. Most preaching on the subject is focused on trying to get young people, single young people, to abstain from sex. Well, good luck with that. The Bible joyfully celebrates God-given erotic love, but the Bible is also quite clear that sexual love is so important and powerful that it is vital to set it in its proper context. Electricity, for example, is important and powerful, but if you stick your finger in the socket to see what happens, you will get more than you bargained for. Unfortunately, the church has a poor record of promoting a positive Christian sexuality. In fact, we have left it to our secular culture to provide the sex education for a generation of young people, setting their expectations for sex in marriage, so that young people think now they have to act and behave like porn stars. It's as though we've read Colossians 3 verse 5 as put sex to death instead of put to death sexual immorality. And actually, St. Augustine carries a lot of the blame for this, as he introduced the idea into the church that sex was the enemy of the spiritual life. For Augustine, the best thing that could be said about sex was that it was a necessary sin to produce children. But sex is not in itself a sin at all. It's a gift from God. And Augustine was hardly objective on the issue. He'd lived a very sexually promiscuous life before his conversion, and behaviour that he very much regretted, and he also struggled with his sexual desires thereafter. In one famous prayer he said, "Lord, deliver me from lust, but not yet." A Christian sexual ethic is not, however, a return to the repressed sexuality associated with the Victorian era. Rather, it's sexuality within the framework of God's good purposes for human flourishing. When we step back from traditional church teaching on sex and look at what the Bible actually says, we discover that it's largely positive. It affirms that our sexuality is intimately connected to the fact that we are made in the image of God. For male and female, he created them. And Theologian Karl Barth demonstrated that relationship is at the heart of what it means to be in the image of God, and that the relationship between male and female is the human expression of our relationship with God. Our human sexuality, our maleness and femaleness, is not just an accidental arrangement of the human species, nor just a convenient way to keep the human race going. We exist, he says, as male and female in relationship. Our sexualness, our capacity to love and be loved, is intimately related to our creation in the image of God. Casual sex for the sake of sex, friends with benefits and all that, empty of any relationship and life commitment to the other, is therefore outside of God's purpose for sex, and in fact denies God's purpose for it. In Genesis 2, verses 24 and 25, we learn about the sexual union between man and woman, and that they were naked and not ashamed. But their lack of shame stems not from ignorance regarding their nakedness, but from the fact that there was wholeness in their relationship. In the pre-fall relationship between Adam and Eve, there is none of the hierarchy or struggle for dominance over the other that became common in human societies after the fall. Before the fall, humans experienced unashamed sexual love within the context of a relationship of mutuality and equality. In other words, the fall did not create sex, it only perverted it. In the creation story, we find the man and the woman drawn to each other, naked and not ashamed. They know their masculinity and femininity are the handiwork of God, as is their passionate affection. Their differences unite them. They are male and female, but also one flesh. The two of them in relationship, their sexuality is the creation of God. Fourthly, we must recognize our own vulnerability towards sexual sin. God has created us as sexual beings, and sexual desire is an essential and normal part of our humanness. Sex, however, is a powerful idol and will always exercise a powerful pull on our heart's affections. The answer then to this idolatry is ultimately to have our hearts captivated by something greater. A warning to avoid something, even something dangerous, is rarely enough. We need to have our hearts and minds captivated by a greater vision of Jesus Christ that stirs us up in us a deeper desire to obey him and root out the sin in our lives. Idolatry always begins in the heart, and it's there that it must be rejected. You see, the thing we need to grasp, really grasp, is that if Jesus Christ is Lord, then Aphrodite is not. And if we have pledged our allegiance to Jesus, the saving King, then we cannot worship at Aphrodite's altar. Thanks for listening.